started, and I believe we are now live. So welcome everybody to our Salem Baptist Church church history class, lesson number 3. Even though this is only going to be one PowerPoint for 3 and 4, I'm going to present the first part of it tonight. So, Kyle, before we get started, would you like to pray for us, brother?
I would be honored. Would y'all bow with me? Father, we thank you for every opportunity that we get to come to your throne of grace. And I just want to lift up everyone who is on this Zoom, that is here physically, and is here just listening, who is here on the camera. And we just want to ask you that your will would be done. We thank you for just instilling into our hearts to want to learn truth, because you are all truth. And we thank you for Richard for taking the time and wanting to teach. And may you speak through your servant. And may your servants not only hear from you and hear this truth, but be doers of your truth. And we thank you for your word. We thank you for you, Lord. We thank you for such a great salvation. Continue to do what is necessary in each one of us to cause us to see things from your point of view. We're so grateful and honored. In Jesus' name we say, amen.
All right. We go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint over here. Can everybody see the screen? Hold on one second. So I can do the Windows. Yeah, let me just do the screen share over here. All right. Is everybody seeing our screen?
Yes, sir. Oh, that's good.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started with church history, lesson number 3. Does anybody have any questions from our prior lessons before we get started? Any comments from last time?
For me, I just wish I'd have been here. Sorry that I missed it, but thank the Lord for live recordings, and we can hear them. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I want this to continue to be a blessing for the church. So tonight we are going to venture away from what we talked about last week, but we are still in our sort of foundations of church history, portion of this course. Last week we talked about the Jewish foundations of the Christian church. But the next 2 weeks is going to be a two-parter. We're going to be talking about this phrase right here. Does anybody know what the phrase tein oikumene means?
Something together?
So that's a good guess. Tein is actually just the indefinite article. I forget which case the Greek here is in. But has anybody ever heard of the term ecumenical?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of when you think of ecumenical?
I've only heard that word in like tangent of like councils, like an ecumenical council, or
yeah,
like
special.
Yeah. So ecumenical, the idea is, at least according to the definition you gave, Taylor, was the councils that were held in either the imperial capital, so you have like the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, because his bishopric is in the capital of what was once the old Roman Empire. But this term oikumene is where you get the term house, and the idea is house as in habitation. So could somebody turn to Luke chapter 2, verse 1, and somebody else turn to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6?
We'll get Luke 1.
Okay.
Luke 2:1.
Oh, 2:1. Okay.
Yeah, chapter 2, verse 1, and then somebody else, Hebrews 1, verse 6. And when y'all get those, you can just go ahead and read.
Already. All right. Luke chapter 2, verse 1.
Mhm.
Those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered.
Okay. And whoever has Hebrews 1, verse 6.
I've got it. And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him.
So it's an interesting word there. The word world is not actually the usual word for world that we see in the New Testament, which would be cosmos, but it's this other word, oikumene. And so the idea here is oikos or oikos being the house, and the idea is habitation. So this is the inhabited earth, or what we would colloquially known as the known world. And so when it says Caesar Augustus sent out a decree that the whole world, it's literally the whole oikumene. And what is meant by then is basically the oikumene, by the time we get to the time of Christ, and especially the early church, this is a colloquial reference to what we now call the Roman Empire. And so it's the known world. It's the Occident, using sort of classical historiography, as opposed to the Orient, which is, in the East, which is sort of unknown. And so when it's saying that, decree went out into the known world, or that Christ came to the known world, it's that Christ came into a specific part of the earth at that time that basically was the Roman world. And the Roman world, of course, was not something that sprung out of nowhere, but it sat on top of a foundation beforehand, both sort of primitive Latin culture as well as Greek culture as well. So over the next two lessons, we're going to be discussing the Greco-Roman world, the pagan world as it existed in the time of Christ. As we discussed Judaism beforehand, and we have to have an understanding of Judaism and of the ancient Israelites on down to the time of Christ in order to understand the sort of Jewish backdrop of the advent of our Lord and the birth of the church. We also have to understand the pagan world, the Greco-Roman world, the oikumene, the Tain oikumene, and the culture that the apostles went out into and that they interacted with, because this foundation will be very, very important in terms of understanding, especially the sort of ancient church. The church of both classical and late antiquity. So the first 500 to 600 years of the church, and even down to this day, whether it be Greek philosophy or Roman law or other forms, we have to understand this culture and this period in history in order to understand the backdrop of the New Testament. So, I thought I would throw you all for a loop here. Does anybody recognize any of these words here? How about the left? Yes. So the language on the left column? Which language is that?
Is that Greek?
Yes, it's Greek to me, as William Shakespeare would write many centuries later, right? And so all of these Greek words have a meaning and a connection to the concepts we're going to be talking about tonight. But all right, so that's the left side, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. But what about the right side?
Latin?
Yes, this is lingua latinae. This is the Latin language, and the top header. Can anybody give me the names of or the English translation of the titles for these two columns? Anybody know what Hellas means?
Oh, no.
This is the Greek word for Greece. The Greeks referred to their own country as Hellas.
Wow.
That's where we get our term Hellenistic from,
Yeah.
the Greek world. And so, yes, we're going to be discussing the history of Greece tonight,
Awesome.
and the Greek world. What about the column on the right? What does the title translate to in English?
Rome?
Rome, yes, that's right. And the Italians to this day still refer to Rome as Roma. So
Right.
we will be discussing next week the Roman world, which absorbed and superseded the Greek world after this week. So I wrote all the titles for many of the subjects we're talking about in Greek and Latin. That way we can actually kind of have a deeper discussion about what they mean. And I want you to kind of see how these words would have existed in their original days. So I don't just want to translate everything, but want you guys to see what the words would have looked like in their day. So
Right.
with that, we will begin. Hellas. This is part 1 of our study of the pagan world. So this title slide, can anybody give me the name of this title? It's a word that we use if the Latin family, when your children are...
Chaos.
Yes, exactly. When they're running around. But we have chaos. And so chaos, I specifically chose this because chaos, as we'll discuss in a little bit, was the beginning of Greek mythology. And so I want to connect that mythological term to an actual historical period to discuss our understanding of Greece. So in the year 1177 BC, there's a great book on this, a YouTube video, maybe I'll throw that in the chat at the end, which talks about how this was one of the most significant years in the ancient world. And the reason for that is this is the year that basically the world ended. The apocalypse of the ancient world, what is called by historians as the Bronze Age collapse. And so what happened in this year, and I guess sort of this succeeding period right around 1200 BC, many of the ancient cultures and civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East all fell within the same short period of time. There was a widespread period of chaotic upheaval that seems to coincide with the time of the judges in biblical history. Many of the ancient either empires or city-states that were well known during that time. So Ugarit was a very important city in Syria, Mycenae on the mainland in Greece, and also the Hittite Empire in Asia Minor itself. All of these states which had anchored the sort of Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East during the Bronze Age collapsed at the same time. Their governments and their cultures fell and, well, not necessarily disappeared, but were superseded by what was a dark age. And so even Egypt, under Ramses the Great, was assaulted by a number of invading peoples from the sea, who we conveniently call the Sea Peoples. Some people think these are actually related to the Philistines from the Old Testament, and the Philistines may have been a subset of the Sea Peoples. And even mighty Egypt itself, it took many wars and a great cost to repulse these invaders from the sea. But cities were burned, temples were thrown down, and culture and civilization as it had existed in the second millennium BC all of a sudden came to an end in a very violent short period of time. And so the Trojan War is allegedly set during this same period of time, and we see the city of Troy over here to the right being sacked by the Achaeans, as they were called, and the city of Troy was burned to the ground and was no more. And so after this time period, the oikumene, the known world, was plunged into a roughly 300-year period of dark ages in which very little literature, very little culture was produced during this time. Towards the end of this time period, though, in the Middle East especially, we see the beginning of the rise of the Assyrian Empire. And so the Assyrian Empire kind of has its apogee in the 8th century BC and rises to kind of replace the void that had existed prior to that. And then Assyria, after about 150 to 200 years sort of period of dominance in this part of the world, and not just dominance, but sort of, hegemony, fell, and the city of Babylon, ancient Babylon, rose in succession from Assyria to essentially take over what Assyria had once controlled. However, during this time, while all of this is happening in the Middle East, and we read about much of this in our Old Testament, there were other historical events happening further to the west. So in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, in the country of Hellas, or the Greek mainland, a city had arisen in the region of Attica to become kind of the predominant city at that time. And this was the city of Athens. And this Greek city-state, this polis, along with other polises, were beginning to come out of this dark age, and culture and literature and new forms of government were being developed. And so the sort of unique aspect of this city of Athens is that they had begun an experiment and government that had not been seen before in any civilization in recorded history up to that point. And they invented a new form of government called demokratia, which we today call democracy.
Right.
And so demokratia, what was demokratia? So before the advent of democracy, the city of Athens, coming out of the Greek Dark Ages after the Bronze Age collapse, had been ruled by a series of magistrates called the archons. And they were assisted by a council of ex-archons called the Areopagus, which is the place in Athens where they met. Does this word ring a bell for our biblical experts here? Yes, from the book of Acts, and we will discuss that later on. One of the things you'll learn, especially about early Christian theology within the early church as we move into the patristic era later on, is that so much of the language that we see both in the New Testament as well as in the early patristic period is indebted to the Greek culture into which the apostles went. And the Greek language is one of the most expressive languages out there, especially as it existed in classical antiquity. And so you'll see a lot of terms that look very familiar as we discuss Greek civilization. So in 594 BC, the Athenian politician Solon set up the ecclesia, or the assembly, in which all free citizens elected the archons, elected city officials, and had the authority to collectively pass laws and even declare war against their enemies. So do people recognize that term, ecclesia?
Ecclesiastes?
Well, yes, that's certainly one way, the preacher, Solomon. But what about ecclesia?
Yeah, the church, huh?
Yeah, the church. And so this term ecclesia actually had a specific meaning in sort of classical antiquity in Athens, but especially as Greek culture spreads, as we'll discover later on, it has a very just kind of general meeting. All it really meant is this is an assembly or a congregation. And what we know as the church is really the ecclesia kuriake. It's the assembly or the congregation of the Lord. And so the early Christians basically appropriate language that was known to the culture around them in terms of describing their own bodies. So Athenian democracy has a number of developments over the succeeding centuries, and it was much written on, and that goes beyond the scope of our lesson tonight. But in 508 BC, Cleisthenes reorganizes the city of Athens around the surrounding region called Attica, basically expanding citizenship to many of the surrounding towns in the region in which Athens sat. And then in 462 BC, Ephialtes limited the power of the Areopagus and extended its membership to all free citizens. So every male citizen over the age of 18 who was free in the city of Athens basically had a role to play in government. And this was unknown prior to the Athenians in the ancient world. And so democracy, it had a different understanding. It kind of came from the people themselves. You didn't have at least initially, the concept of naturalization that we think of today, where somebody could immigrate and gain citizenship. You had to kind of be born into it, and the Athenians saw their democracy as sort of unique to themselves. But nevertheless, it provides a model upon which later representative governments are born. And so this is a 19th century depiction over here to the right of the great Athenian politician and orator Pericles delivering a feminist speech to the ecclesia there in Athens. And so this idea may have been snuffed out in its infancy, had it not been for some very tumultuous events which occurred just 100 years after the time of Solon. And so Marathonion, does anybody know where this is and what Marathonion in Greek may be referencing?
Well, I'm just looking at the scripture, Ed. Did it have to do with Persia?
So Ahasuerus in the Bible actually has a different name that we know not only from the Greek Septuagint, but in our historical textbooks. Does anybody know who Ahasuerus is?
Isn't that Xerxes?
Yes, it's Xerxes. Xerxes the First would be how his name would be pronounced in Greek. And what's interesting about Esther chapter 1, verse 1 is that it says he reigned over an empire that had 127 provinces or satraps, that would be the Persian term, from India to Ethiopia. Now, what is conspicuously missing from India to Ethiopia?
Egypt.
Well, Egypt would be sort of seen as within that realm.
I guess the Middle East, right?
Well, it would have encompassed the Middle East. If you go from India to modern Ethiopia back then, is probably what we think of as modern-day Sudan today. It's a little bit farther north than the country of Ethiopia. But in the known world, what country is missing from Xerxes' domain? It's the subject of our lesson tonight.
Greece?
Greece, yes. And so the writer of Esther conspicuously leaves the nation of Greece out. And it would have been known at that time in history that Xerxes would have actually been engaged in his wars trying to conquer the Greek mainland. And so it is, I think, rather curious that Greece is not mentioned in this section in Esther. So Cyrus the Great the Cyrus that we know from the scriptures. He had conquered basically the old Babylonian Empire all the way down into Egypt and even into Asia Minor. And he had conquered Greek settlers who had settled in Asia Minor, who were known as the Ionian Greeks in 547 BC. And what was interesting about Cyrus is many of the Ionians had started to have their own sort of local democracies as well, is that Cyrus actually left their own sort of local governments in place. So long as they paid tribute to the Persian Empire, he essentially left them to their own sort of local government, and even had many Greeks in that region as representatives of himself. So Cyrus was very much a cosmopolitan emperor. However, the Ionians revolted under his successors, notably Darius I, who is the father of the Xerxes that we see up there at the top bullet point. And so for 6 years, the Ionian Greeks fought for independence against the Persian Empire. However, their quest for independence failed, and they were eventually subdued. And so Darius, in the year 490 BC, sought to punish the main ally of the Ionian Greeks. And so I love, for Jonah, I wanted to put the 300 Rise of an Empire opening scene on here, but that would probably not be appropriate for church given the amount of gore that you see. So in the year 490 BC, as the Persians were disembarking from their ships on the Greek mainland, the Athenians under Themistocles made a daring gambit, and that is instead of waiting to meet the Persians on the mainland, the Greeks struck first. And so as the Persians were disembarking from their ships, the Athenians assaulted the Persians at the beachhead there at Marathonion, or as we know from history, Marathon. And so here's a painting over here of the Greek hoplites, the heavy armored Greek soldiers crashing into the much more lightly armored Persian lines, and you can see the ship back here, and here's the beach of Marathon. Wow. And the Greek hoplites with their superior heavy armor, their bronze weapons, trampling over the more lightly armored, cloth-covered, wooden shielded Persian army. And so outnumbered nearly 3-1, the Greeks inflict really the first major defeat that the Persian Empire had ever experienced since the days of Cyrus. And the Greeks rout the Persians at Marathon, which showed that the Greeks could actually stand up to the world superpower at that time. And so, Ptolemeo, does this word ring a bell? Maybe the term polemics? Somebody who is polemical? What does polemics mean?
To set up an argument against something specifically.
That's how we use it today, but what's the origin? What's the etymology of the word? It's literally war.
Oh, wow.
So to engage in polemics is to engage in war. And so after the Greeks defeated the Persians at Marathon, for the next 150 years, the Greek world was in a near constant state of war, both fighting the Persian menace to the east, as well as fighting amongst each other. And so after Marathon, for the next 40 years, the Greeks would resist Persian invasions into mainland Greece, maintaining their tenuous hold on independence. So in 480 BC, who remembers King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, Gerard Butler and all the abs that we remember from that movie. So the Battle of Thermopylae 10 years later, where the Spartans make their bold stand against the Persians at the Hot Gates. And then later that year, after the Persians had burned Athens to the ground, though Athens had been evacuated, the population had fled to the island of Salamis. The Greeks defeat a Persian naval fleet that once again outnumbered them roughly 3 to 5 to 1. And so the Greeks defeat the Persian fleet to avenge the fallen Spartans, as well as to avenge the sack of Athens that Xerxes' troops had inflicted. And in 479 BC, the next year, the Battle of Plataea, where nearly 40,000 Greeks resist an army of 120,000 Persians, and they defeat the Persians in an overwhelming victory, completely routing the Persian army and driving the Persians out of Greece for good. However, as soon as that great unified Greek victory over the Persians occurred, the Greeks descended into conflict amongst themselves, and the War of the Delian League, which lasted for nearly 30 years, where various Greek city-states were fighting against each other. And at the end of this, Athens had emerged as kind of the dominant power in the Greek world, obviously being the largest city, but also kind of seeing itself as the center of Greek culture. And so a number of city-states were not happy with this turn of events. And so for the next 50 to 60 years, a series of wars fought mainly between Athens and its rival Greek city-state, Sparta, and their various allies. They fought a series of devastating wars against one another, of which Sparta actually won the wars. But the thing about it is the Spartans were very good at fighting, but they were not very good at governing. And so even though the Spartans won the Peloponnesian Wars and instilled a system of government known as the 30 Tyrants upon the city of Athens, their vanquished foe, this system did not last very long, and the Athenians eventually reasserted their independence, and Sparta began to fade into the background as Athens continued its rise. However, another city, Thebes, rose to power to challenge both Athens and Sparta. Thebes is a little bit further north here in Thessaly, which separates Attica from Macedonia here in the north. And so Theban dominance started in 371 BC. However, after Thebes failed to defeat a rival city called Phocis, which I believe Phocis is somewhere down in here, they called for aid from a newly constituted Greek, almost seen as half-barbarian kingdom in the north of Greece that sat up here. And they called upon the king of that country, Philip II, for aid, and that is the country of Macedon, or Macedonia.
Mm-hmm.
And so does anybody know, want to take a guess as to who Philip II was the father of?
I think he had the name, was it Macedonia? I don't know. Maybe
Yeah, so who is the famous Macedonian from the ancient world that we all think about?
Oh, that's right. Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Yes. So after these wars, Philip begins to assert control over Greece, and he gives, he's assassinated in an untimely fashion in 336 BC, and he's succeeded by his young son, Alexandros, or Alexander as we would say in English. And young Alexander is probably, outside of the scriptures, the most pivotal figure in the history of the ancient world, because it's with his conquests that we see the beginnings of Western culture and Western civilization as it exists today. Starting over here in the north of modern-day Greece and the region of Macedonia, Alexander asserted as much control over the Greek mainland as he could, And then with an alliance of Macedonian as well as allied Greek troops, as well as a few barbarians from Thrace and other places in the Balkans, he crossed the Hellespont, the bridge to Greece, right here between, sort of modern-day Eastern Thrace and Turkey, over to Asia Minor. And as he crossed from Europe, as we know it today, into Asia, he threw a spear into the ground, accepting all Asia as a gift from the gods. And he proceeded to the city of Gordium, where he proceeded to cut the Gordian knot to fulfill a prophecy that whoever could untie the Gordian knot, that man would rule all of Asia. And so Alexander solved the mystery not by trying to untie the knot, but by taking his sword and literally slicing through the knot. So the Gordian knot is kind of a proverb for somebody who finds an unconventional way to solve an otherwise intractable problem. And so over the next 5 years, which think about this in the ancient world, Alexander proceeded to conquer all of Asia Minor, Syria, the Holy Land, all of Egypt, Mesopotamia, conquered the entirety of Persia into Central Asia, into countries such as Tajikistan and Uzbekistan today, all the way over into Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even into the Indian subcontinent. And so he had created what was then one of the largest empires the world had ever seen to that point. And so by 329 BC, his rival Darius III, who is the Achaemenid Persian Shahanshah, the King of Kings, as the Persians called their emperor, Darius III had been killed by his own people and his satraps subdued, leaving all of Asia by all of Asia, all of known Asia at that time. Obviously, this doesn't include China or Southeast Asia or places like that, but all of what we think of as the sort of classical civilizations of the known world were in the hands of this one, I believe, late 20s, early 30s young man. I believe he was in his 20s still at that time. And so by 26, 27 years old, this man overthrown the world's most powerful empire. Unfortunately for him, and this is something that, is debated widely by historians, this is kind of one of those proverbs of, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet loses his soul? In 323 BC, when he was only 32 years of age, so that's like 3.5 years younger than me, Alexander dies under mysterious circumstances in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar from the Bible, in Babylon at the age of 32. He kind of made Babylon his central capital from which to rule his empire. But what is significant about Alexander, and this is where I put toward the oikumene, Alexander has this quote that's recorded by history saying, "I'm indebted to my father for living, but to my teacher for living well," specifically referring to his teacher, the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle, who was Alexander's tutor when Alexander was a youth. And so what Alexander did that was different from prior conquerors, many of whom would leave the local culture in place and they would just kind of rule as a distant monarch, gaining money and wealth. Alexander didn't just set out to conquer the world. He set out to change the world and to make the world into the image of Greece. He fundamentally did something that was different than prior conquerors, in which he wanted to spread Greek language and culture and the philosophical tradition that had developed by that point. And so places like Egypt and Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and even deep into Asia had Greek-speaking rulers, and there were Greek temples and Greek philosophical schools. And while he didn't entirely erase the cultures that came before, especially in Persia, which reasserted its independence under the Parthians within a couple of centuries, he had fundamentally changed the world. There was even Buddhist influence in Greek philosophy, and trade and culture spread from east to west in a way that it had not before. And it was all because of Alexander's focus on changing the world into the image of Greece and bringing Greek culture to the known world. He founded a number of cities named Alexandria across the known world. We think of Alexandria in Egypt. And even Kandahar in Afghanistan is the Afghan cognate for Iskander, which was the Persian name for Alexander. And so Kandahar was actually Alexandria. And so there were many, many cities named Alexandria all across the known world. And with this conquest came the Greek language. And so Common Greek, or what we know as Koine Greek, became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, providing fertile soil for new communication of ideas across a large swath of what had been the ancient world. After his death, a number of successor kingdoms, the Diadochi, from the Greek word diadokos, meaning successor, his 4 generals took over his empire, defined the next few centuries until the rise of the Roman Empire that we'll talk about next week. So what was Greek culture? What was the sort of spirit and soul of the Hellenes, as they called themselves, that was so different from the rest of the ancient world? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Greek religion to start. Can anybody read the phrase there at the top of the paragraph, or at the top of the slide? Hint down in the bullet points.
Right speech, thoughts about the gods.
Which is theologia. Theologia, which is where we get our term theology. So theologia, kai, which is the Greek conjunctive word there, so that's and. So theology and mythologia. So what does mythologia sound like?
Mythology.
Mythology, yes. So you had both theology and mythology in the Greek world. And so Plato describes in his famous work, The Republic, that theology is right speech or thoughts about the gods. And so it's the idea of, theos being the word for God, logos being, or logos being the word for word. And so it's the word or the study of the gods. It's the idea of thinking rightly and, propounding doctrine about the gods. Whereas mythologia is kind of a separate act, and it's the idea of storytelling, even fictions, in order to convey moral events. And so this later evolves into a Christian term referring to the stories and tales of prior pagan society, in which those pagans described, creation and their understanding of religion. And so there's what needs to be said, as I mentioned earlier, just going back to this slide. Religion in the ancient world is not the same as it is in the modern era. We owe so much of our concept of religion to Christianity specifically. There was no central organizing principle or authority in pagan religion. There was no paganism, singular. It was really paganisms. Every town, every city seemed to have their own temple or local cult or local deity that they worshipped. And you had poets would sing songs and create rhymes and stories of the gods. There were no holy books. There was no Bible. There was no Quran. There was no, let's say, Book of Mormon. There were no religious holy books, so to speak. Even in India, where you had the Vedas, you had many, many different sort of local expressions of what we kind of anachronistically call Hinduism. There was no singular Hinduism. There was a sort of amalgamation of local, traditions and cults and books that existed, and so paganism, as I mentioned, as a coherent religion or worldview, is really an anachronistic formulation. There is no singular paganism, and so what were the sources then of ancient Greek religion? Obviously, you had great works of poetry such as Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, which talks about the Trojan War, and then King Odysseus trying to make his way back home, and all of the sort of mythological challenges that he and his crew face on their way back home. Hesiod is kind of the first sort of historical slash, I guess he's still kind of legendary in a sense, Greek poet who writes a work called the Theogony, as well as another work called Works and Days, where, according to legend, he met the Muses, who were the goddesses of sort of mystery and revelation on Mount Helicon in Beotia, who gave him a laurel staff of poetry. And we'll see this quote, or a quote later on, that where the Apostle Paul describes Greek religion. So religion was really the domain not of priests, at least in the beginning, not in the what we think of as organized religion, but really the realm of poets who would write these fanciful stories about the gods. There were a number of Greek tragedies as well that played upon religion. So the works of Sophocles and Aeschylus, as well as Euripides. So, for instance, the play Oedipus Rex, about the ill-fated king and his love affair with his mother. These sort of Greek tragedies also were a source of religion. Later on, you have sort of Hellenistic and even into the Roman period writers such as Apollodorus and Ovid, who sort of add and refine and sort of canonize, shall we say, many of these stories. But yes, the sources were originally from the poets, and the earliest of those was from Hesiod, who wrote this work here called Theogonia. Does anybody know what theogony means?
It's like all of the gods, like the study of many gods.
So it's a good guess, and it does include that. But the idea with the goni at the end, or gonia, is the idea of the origin or the beginnings. So it's the origin of the gods. And so Hesiod is the first Greek poet to talk about essentially giving a theory of the universe, a theory of the heavens and the heavenly beings and the heavenly realm, and sort of the origins of our world. And so he starts out his theogony by talking about the very first deity, which is chaos or nothingness. And out of nothingness springs the earth and the sky, Gaia and Uranus, who the Romans later refer to as Uranus. Uranus mates with his own mother, Gaia, to produce Cronus and his siblings, the Titans, Cronus being the Greek term for the Latin Saturn. And so if you can remember your planets, you can remember your chief Greek deities. And so Cronus overthrows his father, Uranus, and swallows his own children whole, all except his youngest son, Zeus. Zeus then, through kind of his own trials and travails, ends up freeing his siblings, who are called the Olympians, who then engage in a war against the prior generation, which is Cronus's generation of deities, called the Titans. And this is the Titanomachy, or the War of the Titans. And so Zeus and his Olympian siblings overthrow their boomer parents. Their parents. I had to throw in that jab for our modern context. They overthrow the Titans, and they establish a realm of the gods on Mount Olympus, and Zeus becomes the final king of the gods. And so many of our New Testament words, such as irene or thanatos or dike, are personified deities in Greek religion, which is something that's different about the Greeks than, say, the Egyptians or the Babylonians, is that the Greeks take abstract concepts and turn them into deities. And this is really unusual in the ancient world. You know, you look at the Egyptian gods and, you know, you have Anubis, who's like a dog, and, you know, Set, who is like an ibex, and Ra, who is a falcon. And they're very concrete, you know, conceptions of deity. Whereas the Greeks are expressing their religion in a very sort of different way than the sort of Eastern religions of, you know, Babylon as well as Egypt, and that they're taking these abstract concepts. And I think that there's going to be a connection here to what we'll talk about in a little bit, that it's almost a higher conception of God than what the sort of Eastern religions would have conceived, because you have these sort of abstract principles that are being personified. And so that's sort of the story of Greek, you know, mythology. And I mean, we could talk for, you know, a long time about all the different, you know, Greek myths and, you know, sort of Greco-Roman religion. But I want to talk a little bit about the praxis, which is, anybody have an idea of praxis, what this might mean?
I don't know what it means, but fun fact, that's the name of the exam for like entering professional teaching, is the practice exam.
Yes. And I actually do believe our term practice comes from this. So praxis is not theology. It's not mythology. It's the way things are lived out in daily life. So it's the practical practical aspect of religion, as opposed to the sort of theological or theoretical or philosophical. So how did ordinary Greeks go about engaging in religion in their day? And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's no unified priestly class nor codified set of sacred books in Hellenistic civilization. Religion was a local affair that was often centered on cult practices of specific deities and specific locales. So you think about Athena, the goddess of wisdom in Athens, or the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, Diana or Artemis in the city of Ephesus. These deities had, you know, sort of local cult shrines, and, you know, the people would go to the various different cult shrines and, you know, offer, you know, their form of worship to these various deities, you know, in different locales. There was no universal God that kind of presided over the whole world. Yes, Zeus was the head god. In a lot of ways, later on, there's some almost monotheistic tendencies amongst pagans who would exalt Zeus or his Roman counterpart, Jupiter. But the public worship of the gods was a part of your civic duty and a part of your, you know, sort of everyday life as a Greek. And so you would go to temples, and outside of temples, you would have altars where they would engage in animal sacrifice. So unlike the pagan Celtic peoples to the north, or, you know, the Canaanite-derived Phoenicians to the south who would engage in human sacrifice, the Greeks and the Romans engaged in animal sacrifice. The Romans actually considered human sacrifice to be a practice of the barbarian peoples to their north. And so it was one of the ways that the Romans saw themselves as civilized. Yes, we may execute lots of people and kill lots of people, but at least we're not ritually sacrificing them. And so they did have much animal sacrifice. And you had many public festivals and cult practices that had, you know, sort of regular occurrences and periodic occurrences throughout the year. So you had the Olympic Games to Zeus and Olympia, for instance. And for those who were unsatisfied with the sort of public sanctioned cults, you had these mystery cults. So things like the Eleusinian mysteries, of which many Roman emperors would later on be initiated into. These were engaged by members of the mystery cult. And so like Mithraism, as we'll talk about later, was a mystery cult in which you had to kind of know the secret handshake. The thing I think would be the closest thing today would be like Freemasonry would be like a mystery cult, because, you know, only people who are kind of in the lodge knows what's going on. And it's not necessarily open to the public. And so you did have these mystery cults as well. Sometimes these would be tolerated and even sanctioned, and other times they would essentially be banned. And so the people who were seeking something beyond the sort of sanctioned public worship could engage in these other mystery cults. So, but in addition to theologia and mythologia, you had a separate metaphysical tradition as well, that maybe in Persia you saw somebody like Zoroaster, or in India you have somebody like, you know, the Buddha, who would engage in this next activity. But this is really another novelty sort of in human history, that beyond the mere religious practices, the Greeks had developed another metaphysical tradition that became definitional to Hellenistic civilization. And can anybody guess what that metaphysical tradition was? Going once, going twice. Here we are, Philosophia. Come on, guys. We all know this, right?
Yeah.
It's not just Greek mythology that we study when we study the ancient world, but we study Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
So the philosophical tradition was a separate tradition that developed alongside the religious tradition of the Greeks, which was really unique, once again, in human history. All of the sort of Eastern, civilizations that we think about, whether it be Egypt or Babylon or Persia or India or China, they hadn't really developed a sort of formalized philosophical tradition in the way that the Greeks did. The Greeks were really, once again, pioneers in this form of metaphysics. And so, unlike the popular religion that existed in their day, the philosophers sought to understand the universe through reason and logic. And so while the philosophical tradition often complemented the popular religion of the day, there are many times in which the philosophical tradition clashed with popular religion as well, and we will see that. So there's three main periods of sort of Greek philosophy prior to the rise of the Roman Empire. The first being the pre-Socratic or early Greek philosophers. So this is going all the way back to the 7th down to the sort of beginnings of the 5th century BC. Does anybody know how to pronounce this first name? Anybody ever have to guess or calculate the angle inside of a inscribed circle?
You.
So this is Thales of Miletus, who is universally regarded, at least traditionally regarded, as the first of the Greek philosophers. There's a portrait bust of him on the right. According to Aristotle, he was the first philosopher. And so he was the first person that we know of in history to propose a naturalistic explanation as opposed to a supernaturalistic explanation for the universe. And he developed many mathematical as well as scientific theories. So anybody remember Thales' theorem about how if you have two angles...
It's like the triangle theory.
Yeah, exactly. And you inscribe that inside a circle that you can predict what the third angle was. So in addition to their sort of metaphysical musings, the philosophers engaged in much of what we would think of as natural science, even though they didn't have the categories that later Christian civilization develops. It's kind of the beginnings. And Thales proposed, as opposed to the theogony that we saw earlier, that everything came out of one beginning, one arche, which he thought was water. Anaximander was another sort of subsequent philosopher in this early tradition who said that the arche, or the original substance of the universe, was the ether, or essentially air. You had Xenophanes, who was an early materialist. He ridiculed the anthropomorphism of the gods. Pythagoras, where we know our Pythagorean theorem, he sought to reconcile belief and reason. You had Heraclitus, who, as opposed to seeing everything coming out of sort of one substance, he thought that he had this almost pantheistic idea of, the universe, the sort of Panta Rei, the everything flows together, in contrast to everything coming out of a single beginning or a single arche. Parmenides of Elea, he said the first principle of being was one unchanging substance. And then you start getting into further materialist schools, such as the atomists or the pluralists, so Anaxagoras, as well as Democritus, who was the first to propose that everything in the universe was made up of atoms, or these fundamental, undividable elements.
Building blocks.
Building blocks that the world was made up of. And so, it's reminiscent of our scientific theory today, and obviously he served as an inspiration for many Renaissance philosophers in that regard. Then you had the sophists, so people like Protagoras, who thought that man was the measure of all things. And so this is the sort of early Greek philosophical tradition. However, there is a seminal figure who really formalizes and brings philosophy to the common man, and that is, of course, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates. He was an Athenian and is considered the father of classical Greek philosophy, so moving from the early period into the classical period of Greek philosophy. And so he was the first to turn philosophy from sort of an elitist pursuit of a few rich guys who had money to kind of sit around and think into a common study. He was described as bringing philosophia down from the heavens. And so he had a number of ideas that proved influential later on. So the Socratic method, which we still use to this day, which is a dialectical approach to knowledge where you have question and answer. So I ask a question and then you respond to me with another question that kind of pushes the conversation forward. He had this phrase, "I know that I know nothing," kind of proposing limits to human knowledge. But he was real focused on virtue as well and right living. The idea of the care of the soul, that cultivating virtue is more important than pleasure in life. And he had this idea of self-examination, that we are to know thyself. And he was also one of the first political philosophers as well, where he talked about the importance of adhering to sort of divine, unchanging law, almost like what we think of as natural theology in a sense, as well as justice. He challenged the popular conceptions of the gods, and that's ultimately what got him in trouble. Some people say he's the first recorded atheist in history. And so he was put on trial by the Athenian elite for asabia, which we kind of crudely translate as impiety, but it's the idea that he would not engage in the public worship of his day and eschewed the gods of the poets, and instead sought to understand the universe through reason. And so for corrupting the youth, he was forced to drink poisoned hemlock and died thereof. What's really striking about Socrates, though, is from all of the influence that he's had, we actually have nothing from his own hand. Everything from his life are from his students. And notably, can anybody think of Socrates' most famous student?
Didn't you say that was Alexander the Great?
No, it's
before him.
It's another philosopher. We just mentioned him earlier.
Aristotle?
No,
not Aristotle.
He wrote Republic.
Yes, that is
Uh,
Plato.
Ah,
So Plato was another Athenian and a student of Socrates. What's interesting, Plato was actually, I guess he had to be a soldier at some point. He witnessed Athens' defeat to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War and the rise of the 30 tyrants in Athens. And he actually fought in the Corinthian War in the early 4th century BC. What he was notable for was that he actually founded a school, the first philosophical school, known as the Academy. And this was in Athens. And so he's traditionally ascribed 36 of his dialogues as well as 13 letters. People traditionally accept at least 24 of these dialogues as genuine. Some of these are thought to be later, sort of pseudepigraphal works. All later forms of theoretical and classical philosophy are influenced by Platonism. And an example for us that's important to the early church is Neoplatonic thought, which develops during the Roman period, has a massive influence on early Christianity, as well as other religious traditions such as Gnosticism and Manichaeism and other ideas as well. Number of famous works, his famous Republic, the Timaeus, his Apology, his Georgios, his Laws, his Symposium. He had a number of different philosophical ideas, most notable being the theory of the forms, and that is that there's a perfect morphe of every reality. That is, if we consider the idea of a square, there is no perfect square in the real world. If you go down to the atomic or subatomic level, nothing is no drawing of a square that we can ever do is truly square. Even if you take computer graphics and all that kind of stuff, there's still, the sort of, uncertainty principle of the atoms and that kind of stuff. But we know that there's such a thing as a square, that there's this theoretical idea of what a square is. And so for Plato, that was the morphe, that there's the perfect square that exists only theoretically, by which we judge all other squares. When I preached at Livingston, I actually talked about this. For the Apostle Paul actually makes use of this concept in Philippians chapter 2, where he says that Christ is the morphe of God. And so, he says he's the image of the invisible God, or that's the icon, which is another term. But he talks about he was in the form of God, although he existed in the form of God. And you may have, groups like Jehovah's Witnesses will misuse this, where they say, see, he wasn't actually God. He only existed in the form of God. What they don't realize is it's actually teaching the opposite of what they say, because he's saying that take the perfect conception of who God is, and that is Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is the perfect morphe of the reality of what we think of when we think of God. And so he's saying, no, in fact, Christ is the morphe of God. He is existing eternally as the very ideal of who God is. And so Paul, interacts with this philosophical tradition as well. His epistemology was that true knowledge is not through senses, but through reason of the forms. He has the famous allegory of the cave, that most people are trapped in the sensical world or the empirical world, and few escape into the sunlight of reason. The so-called red pill, Taylor probably knows this, like the Matrix is like an example of the allegory of the cave. Where Neo is, escaping the, fake world and, getting into which is the Matrix, into the real world. And obviously, the manosphere guys, are not so philosophical, not so kings like Andrew Tate like to crudely employ these philosophical concepts. But these have a very ancient tradition, and they're rooted in Platonic philosophy. His Ethics in the Soul, he taught a tripartite anthropology, the idea of reason, spirit, and appetite, and that virtue is spirit and appetite subject to reason. That's different than what we teach as Christians. We have a bipartisan anthropology. There is the material man, and then there's the immaterial man. That the soul and the spirit are really synonyms for the same sort of inner man. Whereas in Platonic philosophy, the soul and the spirit are often they're broken out into separate ideas. He had political philosophy where he taught about a utopia that would be ruled over by a philosopher king, which the closest example that we have in history is actually from the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, who we'll talk about later on, who is a Stoic philosopher who achieved the highest of highs by becoming a Roman emperor at the height of the Roman Empire. And Marcus is a very tragic figure in many ways because he tried to rule over Rome as a philosopher king, and yet his reign marked essentially the apogee of the Roman world, and after he died, Rome began to decline. And then he taught love, and that this was the highest form, the highest morphe of beauty itself. And there's this quote over here by, I believe it's a British writer, Alfred North Whitehead, who says, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." That's how highly he thought of Plato.
Wow.
And of course, Plato was not alone, but he had a very prodigious and precocious student who challenged many of his ideas, and who was probably the only student that Plato probably in the end thought his equal, and that was our next philosopher, which, can anybody guess who that is?
Is it Aristotle now?
Yes, Aristotle.
Right.
His student. So you have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. It's almost like living in the time of the Reformation, where you have Calvin and Christopher Columbus. All these like influential people are living in the same period in history. Aristotle, unlike Socrates and Plato, was not a native Athenian by birth. He was born in Stagira in Macedon, up in northern Greece. And he immigrated to Athens at the age of 17 to study under Plato at the academy. Plato was so impressed by his young pupil that he referred to him as the mind of the school, that he thought that Aristotle was the most brilliant of his pupils, and he was not wrong in that assessment. However, he left Athens in 348 BC when Plato died. He became disillusioned with the leadership of the academy after Plato's death. And he was invited by Philip of Macedon in 343-342 BC to educate Philip's son, Alexander. Yes, that Alexander. So imagine the world's greatest conqueror being taught by the world's foremost philosopher, and what kind of relationship that must have been. Plato had a falling out later in life with his student, though, because interestingly enough, or not Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle thought that Greek learning and Greek philosophy was unique to the Greeks. And he didn't like Alexander's project of taking Hellenism to the barbarian world. If anything, Aristotle was kind of a nationalist and even a racist to an extent, whereas Alexander was a much more cosmopolitan individual. And so Aristotle and Alexander had a falling out later in Alexander's life, even though Alexander continued to revere his teacher even after their falling out. So Aristotle challenged Plato's ideas. And as you saw from that famous painting from Raphael earlier, which I'll go back to, the two philosophers here at the very center of the philosophical tradition, all of these figures are supposed to represent, a different philosophical person. You have Plato here, I believe, because he's pointing upward to the realm of the forms, whereas Aristotle is pointing outward towards us, to the real world is where we're supposed to derive our knowledge. And so Aristotle reverses his teacher's idea, and that instead of teaching from a sort of theoretical or idealistic form of knowledge, he taught an empirical form of knowledge, and the idea that knowledge begins with the as opposed to Plato believing that knowledge began with the sort of ideal, and that everything has a telos or an end purpose. He taught the four causes. So there's a material cause, what something is made of; the formal cause, its essence; the efficient cause, which is it as an agent of change, like how is it moving in the world; and then the final cause, or the telos, the purpose of a thing. He standardized the logical process. So, and his idea of logic remained dominant until the 19th century. So think about that. Nearly 2,500 years, his theory of logic remained supreme. In his metaphysics, he was really focused on this idea of the uncaused causer, which this comes to have an important role in Christian, later Christian theology. The five elements that we talk about, like the fifth element from the movie, you have earth, water, fire, air, an ether, or the band Earth, Wind, and Fire. They're all, I'm sorry guys for the bad humor, but I got to throw it in there. You have, in his concept of ethics, this idea of eudaimonia, and yes, that's where we get our term demon, but it had a more general meaning in the idea of the good spirit is that one is to live virtuously, and that by living virtuously, that is the cause of a good life. He taught the golden mean, that virtue lies between two opposite vices, and then he had this idea of phronesis, that logic and reason should guide our actions. He was also a political philosopher and said that a well-ordered state helps citizens to achieve virtue. I think Minnesota could probably use that right now. And then he wrote extensively on natural sciences, biology, optics, astronomy, geology, and physics. He actually overturned several popular physical ideas, and they turned out to be true. And Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotle. What's interesting, though, I like this quote. He died kind of a broken man. After Alexander's death, there was hostility in the aftermath of his death and the rise of the Diadochi, where Athenians, they'd always kind of considered Macedonians to be kind of country bumpkins. It's like how people in New York would consider us down here in Louisiana or Mississippi, that were just kind of backwards hicks, kind of almost half barbarian. And so Macedonians were not well liked in the city of Athens. And so after the death of Alexander, Macedonians became unpopular in Athens, and after he was denounced as being impious, just like his academic grandfather, Socrates, and we all know how that turned out for Socrates. Instead of accepting Socrates' fate, Aristotle fled the city of Athens, saying, "I will not let Athens sin twice against philosophy," with an obvious reference towards the forced suicide of Socrates. And so he died less than a year later of natural causes. From the classical period, though, after the death of Alexander and the death of Aristotle within a year of each other, we enter the Hellenistic period, which goes from the death of Alexander and the death of Aristotle down to the Battle of Actium, in which the future emperor, the redheaded stepchild, Octavian, Gaius Octavian, who is later Caesar Augustus, sort of secures control for himself and his burgeoning empire. We have the Hellenistic period, and so this is the period of sort of, Greece beyond Greece, where now the philosophical tradition and, Greek culture and language has spread beyond the Greek mainland into, Asia Minor, into Egypt, into the Fertile Crescent, into Iran, and even into southern Italy among Greek colonists who set up shop in Sicily and in the boot of Italy, who will feature heavily next week. So these later Hellenistic philosophical schools kind of develop the ideas of the Socratic schools. where you have like the Cynics and the Sinaics, and then the dialectical school, which was the first to promote conditional statements and propositional logic. But then the two major Hellenistic philosophical traditions, and we see this featured in the New Testament, is Stoicism, which was developed by Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BC, so about 100 years after Aristotle, where he taught that the goal of life is living in accord with nature. He proposed this unified account of the world via logos, physics, and ethics, and that a wise person, the true sophos, the true philosopher, is someone who is free of passions, that he is apatheia, that he is apathetic. Now, that means something different than what we say as apathetic. When we say of apathetic, it's like you picture the teenage guy on his, beanbag chair in his parents' basement eating Cheetos and, sipping Mountain Dew and Red Bull while he plays, video games. That's not the kind of apathy that he's talking about. In a sense, we can actually say that God is apathetic, and this is something that we will talk about later on. The Westminster Confession and the 1689, our own confession, talks about that, how God is without body parts or passions. And the idea of passions is that you are seized not so much by emotions, but by movements that you can't necessarily control. That's where the term suffering comes from, passio, where our term pathology comes from, disease. You're just afflicted with these things. Whereas we know God is not passionate in that way. He is not moved by things external to himself. And so God is free of passions. And so in a lesser sense, the wise person, the sophos, is also free of these passions. And as I mentioned earlier, Stoicism actually reaches kind of its heights as an intellectual tradition under the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher king. He was literally a Stoic philosopher who became the Roman emperor and wrote his famous work, The Meditations, that is kind of the primary work that we think of for Stoicism today. In contrast to the Stoics, there was another philosopher named Epicurus who wrote around the same time as Zeno, who proposed kind of an opposite philosophy. And this was Epicureanism. And this is the idea that the universe is made up of matter and made up of atoms. So he's coming out of that sort of atomistic tradition. And that outside of matter, there is the void. And so all atoms move downward, but sometimes they randomly move. So this is like the uncertainty principle that, oddly enough, we see an example of even in 20th century physics with the theory of relativity. And that in this sort of uncertainty or randomness, this is the origin of free will, according to Epicurus. So he was an empiricist in his epistemology. He says our preconception of the forms can be wrong, and we need to correct our conception of the forms based on experience. So there's the idea of like you're walking towards a building and you think it's a square building, but because of your perception, you perceive it as square, but then you get up close to it and you see it's actually curved and it's actually like a round building. And so we had a form or an idea of what this square building was, but it actually turns out it's a round building just because of an optical effect. And so we need to correct our understanding of the forms based off of empirical belief. And he discouraged the fear of the gods in order to make life happy, almost atheistic in its outlook. And so they were hedonistic. They wanted to maximize pleasure to the extent that they could also avoid harm. Epicurus was probably more measured in his idea of hedonism than many of his students. But he discouraged both marriage and politics because those would increase your passions. And decrease your pleasure. So there's a lot that can be said there. So how does this intersect with Christianity? So Romans 1:16. Can anybody translate this into English or give a good guess knowing what you know about Romans 1:16?
Mm,
Judeo te proton kai Helene, or Helene. So remember hoi judeoi from last week? So this is the singular, the Jew, and I believe this is in the infinitive. So to the Jew, proton, like prototype, so like the first. So to the Jew first, and we complete the verse. So the gospel is the power of God for salvation to all believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Greek being sort of a generic term for Gentile at times in the New Testament.
right.
And so as Christianity moves out from Judea and Samaria into the oikumene, it encountered both paganism, popular pagan religion, as well as the philosophical tradition. We see St. Paul here on Mars Hill on the very Areopagus that we talked about earlier. And so while Christianity offered a radical rejection of these metaphysical systems, it also interacted with these systems. And so for better or for worse, the early Christian church offered both an alternative to the prevailing religion and philosophies of the day, but it was also influenced by those very religious and philosophical traditions. And so once again, we have Paul here preaching to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in Athens from the Mars Hill itself. And so there are numerous references to both Greek religion and Greek philosophy in the New Testament. John has the idea of the logos or the logos that it features prominently in the philosophical tradition. And can somebody turn to Acts 17, and we'll read verses 18 through 28. Has anybody got it?
I got it. Acts 17, you said?
Starting in verse 18.
Okay, here I go. Acts 17, beginning at verse 18. And also, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seemed to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was proclaiming the good news of Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you are speaking? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. So we want to know what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something newer. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. Therefore, would you worship in ignorance? This I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring.
Amen.
Amen.
And so
Amen.
Paul is using this philosophical tradition and also the religious tradition of the poets. And what's interesting, the altar to the unknown God, Epimenides, who is a sort of semi-legendary, we don't know if he actually existed, pre-Socratic early Greek philosopher. He's the one that made the famous quote that Paul uses. In him we move and live and have our being. And he's turning the quote on its head because Epimenides said this of Zeus. Whereas Paul is saying, this is of the unknown God whom I'm going to proclaim to you now. And what's interesting about the story of Epimenides is when he came to Mars Hill, when he came to the Areopagus, which is the Greek original, Mars Hill is the Latin translation, or our English transliteration of the Latin, because the Greek god Ares is the god of war, Mars is the Roman god of war, the cognate. Epimenides was said to have led some sheep up onto the Areopagus, and as the sheep lay down on the Areopagus, he commanded the men of Athens to erect altars to a salutary god. And the idea is that these are gods that, may not even be worshipped. And so this idea of an unknown God. And so Paul is, in a sense, fulfilling a legend or a prophecy that the Greeks had. And so he is making known to them the unknown God that going all the way back 600, 700 years before that Epimenides had told them to erect an altar to. He's now saying, the time of ignorance has ended, and now I'm going to proclaim to you who that unknown God is. And that is when he gives them the gospel. And what's interesting, they don't respect him at first because they call him an idle babbler, and I believe the real sort of transliteration is that he's a seed picker. Yeah. The idea being that he just kind of picks and chooses various, philosophical ideas and doesn't have a coherent philosophy. And so they think that who is this strange man, this Judean coming into our midst, talking to us about this crucified Savior who rose again bodily on the third day. And for many of the philosophers, they had no conception of this. But as you read at the end of the chapter, there are a few who do, and some come to faith. And so there's a number of references. I have them here in the PowerPoint. The people of Lystra a few chapters earlier, they thought Paul and Barnabas were Hermes and Zeus because they had performed a miracle. DK is the personification of a deity. This is the Maltese, the Maltans, when Paul is shipwrecked on Malta and he gets bitten by the serpent. They say, well, justice has sought this man out because he must have done something wrong. But when Paul lives, they realize, oh my goodness, this guy is something else. And so, there's several quotes from philosophers, as well as much reference to both philosophical terms and language, as well as even to the popular religions of the day. And so with that, I will stop my share, and we will end the main portion of the lesson today. So that is Hellas. And next week we will discuss Roma.